Ellen Wingate sighed as her clamoring first graders went through the lunch line. Macaroni and cheese with chocolate pudding for dessert. Chocolate always made Billy Zabinski hyper, which was fine if he could run off some of that energy during noon recess. But today the wind was gusting, and it was below zero.
"Miss Wingate, Billy's playing around with my braids again."
"Billy, I want you to sit here." Ellen caught Billy just as he was about to dunk Tina Halverson's long blonde braids in his milk and moved him to another table.
"Are we going to get outside today, Miss Wingate?"
Tommy Barnes looked up from his plate and gave her a gap-toothed smile. Tommy was a dear child, freckle-faced, with an unruly shock of bright red hair, and every time he lisped, he reminded Ellen of Ron Howard in The Music Man. Before she could answer, Billy Zabinski chimed in.
"Please, Miss Wingate, we've been real good all morning. Would you let us out?"
Ellen bit back her laughter. Billy made school sound like a prison, and he did have a point. It was February in Minnesota, and for the second week running she'd had to amuse them after lunch.
"I know you've been good, Billy, but it's much too cold. We'll have our recess in the classroom, and I promise we'll do something extra special." "We could play eraser tag,"
Colleen Murphy suggested.
"Perhaps,"
Ellen sighed. The last time they'd played eraser tag in the classroom, they'd tipped over a desk and Annie Benson had skinned her knee. It would be safer to read them the latest Dr. Seuss book, if Billy would shut up long enough to listen.
"All right, now, is everyone settled?"
31 heads nodded in unison, and Ellen smiled. They were good kids, but a 7-hour school day was much too long without the regular breaks for recess. Actually, buttoning and snapping and zipping up 31 sets of winter clothes was a trial in itself. They waddled out onto the playground like little stuffed bundles for 10 minutes, barely mobile until the bell rang and she had to go through the whole process again in reverse. The alternative was trying to have recess in the classroom without breaking either the furniture or their necks.
"Be good for Mrs. Hino now."
Ellen turned to the lunchroom monitor, an elderly woman with a hearing problem. When Ellen first started at Garfield Elementary, she'd asked the principal whether Mrs. Hino's hearing loss had occurred before or after she'd taken the job as lunchroom monitor. But Mr. Eicht had no sense of humor, nor did the rest of his staff. Ellen wondered whether it had something to do with enduring the endless Minnesota winters year after year.
"Mrs. Hino,"
Ellen raised her voice,
"you can send Billy to get me in the lounge when everyone's through eating."
Mrs. Hino nodded, and Ellen beat a hasty retreat. She had 10 minutes, perhaps 15 if Mary Christine Fanger dawdled over her food. When the current year had opened, Ellen had been delighted to find that the 1st and the 6th grades had common lunch periods. That meant she'd see Rob Applegate in the teacher's lounge every day. Since he was the only male teacher and single, and she was the only female teacher under 40, it seemed natural that eventually they'd get together. 28 years old, Ellen hadn't been out on a date since her junior year in college, when her roommate's fiancé had buttonholed one of his friends to take her to their engagement party. Ellen's escort had danced with her dutifully, but the moment the party was over, he'd dropped her off at her dorm, and she'd never heard from him again. Men just didn't seem to be interested in tall, lanky women with glasses. Of course, she had plenty of men friends. She helped them write their term papers and study for their exams, but they'd never shown any signs of wanting a closer relationship. Rob Applegate was different. A 36-year-old bachelor who lived in an apartment over his mother's garage, he was as tall as she was and almost as skinny. Alma Jacobson, who taught 3rd grade and knew everything about everyone in Thief River Falls, said he didn't have a girlfriend but that his mother was hoping he'd get married before she was too old to enjoy her grandchildren. And he seemed to like Ellen, always stopping by her room to ask how someone's younger brother or sister was doing. One day over coffee in the teacher's lounge, Rob had mentioned that he didn't like to see women in slacks. Ellen had never worn them to school again, and when he'd said that his favorite color was aqua blue, she'd gone right out and bought an aqua blue